In 1712, in the hot, fertile heart of New Orleans, the vast cotton plantations, marked by the constant creaking of wagons and the relentless labor of slaves, stretched for miles like the empire of men who seemed invincible. It was a world where blue blood was worth more than sweat, and where marriage wasn't a matter of love, but of power. It was in this world that Sophia Bennett was born, a 19-year-old girl with eyes that prayed more than they dreamed, and hands calloused from a lifetime of serving. Her parents were loyal workers on the massive Parker estate, and they raised her like a rare jewel, pure, untouched, destined for the convent. Since childhood, Sophia claimed her calling was to serve God, to live within stone walls, far from the temptations of the world. She dreamed of silence, of sacred hymns, of peace. But destiny, oh, that tailor of wild threads, was already stitching another story for her. A story not of white veils and silent chapels, but of makeshift wedding dresses and kisses placed gently on the forehead. Ethan Parker was the kind of man everyone knew, even without ever seeing him. The Cotton King, they whispered in markets, taverns, and kitchens. At 16, he lost both parents in a tragic accident involving a runaway carriage and a rainy night. He inherited land, debt, and a last name far too heavy for a boy. But he didn't just survive, he built an empire. He transformed small fields into endless acres, bought neighboring estates, and dominated the cotton industry throughout the South. Tall, rigid in posture, cold-eyed and tight-lipped, Ethan was respected, feared, and desired. His image was that of an untouchable man, as if carved from stone. And yet, like all empires, there was something hidden within, some kind of emptiness, a nameless echo. It was in that inner silence that a promise was stitched. Marriage to Avery Collins, the beautiful daughter of Philip Collins, an ambitious businessman who exchanged his daughter's hand for land he could never afford. Avery, on her part, was a storm in the shape of a woman. Sharp-tempered, she couldn't bear being touched without permission, let alone handed over like a bargaining chip. From the start, she despised Ethan. She called him a rich farmer behind his back, mocked his silence, and refused to learn any wifely customs. She dreamed of freedom, of Paris, of silk dresses not bought with dowries. And then came Peter Callahan, a traveling salesman with sky-blue eyes and a smile that had seen all the world's pain. He arrived like a fresh breeze, handsome, charming, selling fabrics, jewels, and exotic perfumes. And when he saw Avery, he also saw his way out. He surrounded her with gifts, sweet words, and secret dinners in the back garden of the Collins mansion. Within months, Avery no longer thought of Ethan or marriage. She thought of escape, of letters, of trains, of freedom. Peter knew how to lead a lady, and Avery wanted to be led. On the wedding day, the church was adorned with flowers picked before dawn. The windows of the Parker estate were wide open, the table was set, the bells ready to ring. Ethan wore the most expensive suit he had ever owned. But Avery never came. The carriage sent for her returned empty. And on her bed, a sealed letter. She had run away with Peter. For good. The humiliation was so deep the guests couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. But he said nothing. Just stared at the empty altar. And then went home. And there, in the heat of his fury, he did the unthinkable. He summoned Sophia's parents and backed them against the wall. Either your daughter walks down that aisle today, or you leave this land forever. No colonel in the South will ever hire you again. It was cruel, unfair, but final. Panicked, they begged their daughter. Sophia, through tears and silent prayers, said yes. For her family's honor. For the faith that still held her upright. And so, just hours later, Sophia Bennett, the servant who had never owned a dress, who slept in a room behind the kitchen, who prayed daily to remain invisible to men, stood at the altar, wilted flowers in her hair, wearing a hastily adjusted gown. The priest, not knowing what else to do, just followed the rite. Ethan stood beside her, ill, impassive, but inside something burned. It wasn't desire, nor hope. It was fury. The ceremony was short. Their hands touched, cold. No kiss was exchanged. Just the dry words of a yes that sounded more like a held-back scream. Sophia walked out of that church with watery eyes, feeling like a lamb on its way to the slaughter. And when they arrived at the estate, she was led to the master bedroom. She expected the worst. She prayed for protection. She prayed for a miracle. That night the unexpected happened. Ethan entered slowly, as if stepping into a temple. Sophia sat at the edge of the bed, trembling. When he approached, she closed her eyes, awaiting her ruin. But what came was a kiss on the forehead. Long silent. Then he turned, walked to the door, and slept in the guest room. In the solitude of that strange night, Sophia cried. Not out of fear, but out of confusion. Who was this man, seemingly made of stone, yet who left her space to breathe? What did he want from her, if not her body? And why, deep inside, was something beginning to wonder if God was truly giving up on his plans, or simply handing her a different kind of calling? Stay with us. In the next chapter, discover how love begins in silence and grows in gestures. But first, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments, what kind of love story would you like to see here? This channel is your home, and your story can begin now. Night had fallen like a veil of uncertainty over the vast Parker estate. The house, once prepared for a noble wedding, now exhaled silence and embarrassment. The flowers still perfumed the hallways, and the candles, carefully lit hours earlier, now burned for an event that would never happen. Sophia was in one of the upstairs bedrooms, wearing the improvised wedding dress. Her hair hastily braided by the trembling hands of maids who were calling her ma'am for the first time. Outside the door, the world remained suspended. No one dared to make a sound. Not even the horses' hooves or the footsteps of servants broke the strange spell of that unexpected night. And Ethan had been silent ever since Avery's eyes failed to appear at the church, ever since he learned Peter Callahan's carriage had rushed off before dawn. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy as stone. His body exhausted from rage and shame, but his mind drifted. When he stopped in front of the door where Sophia waited, he didn't knock. He opened it gently, almost respectfully. The room smelled of lavender and melting candle wax. She was sitting at the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, head bowed, the veil hanging from her bun like a punishment. When she saw him enter, she stood, her body trembling, not from cold but fear. She had never been alone with a man before, much less a man like Ethan Parker, who, despite his youth, already carried the reputation of a king and a tyrant. His eyes rested on her with something unexpected. No lust, no anger, only weariness. Sophia tried to speak, but her voice failed. Her throat was dry and her thoughts at war. What should she say? That she didn't want to be there. That she still dreamed of the convent, of the nuns singing at dawn, of the peace behind cloistered walls. But nothing came out. Ethan walked toward her slowly, as if trying not to frighten a wounded bird. He stopped a few steps away, raised his hand, and instead of touching her body, he touched only her head. He placed a chaste kiss on her forehead, the strangest and kindest gesture she could imagine. And then, without a word, he turned and left the room. Sophia heard the footsteps fade and the sound of a door closing down the hall. The guest room. He had gone to sleep alone. That night Sophia didn't sleep. She sat by the window and watched the fields outside. The cotton glowed under the moonlight as if stars had fallen to the earth. The place was familiar, but now it was also a prison. What kept her awake wasn't just fear. It was the mystery. Who was Ethan Parker after all? The man who threatened to expel her family with cruelty, or the man who kissed her forehead and chose solitude? She didn't know. But a question began to bloom in her heart, and it wasn't about him. It was about herself. What happens to a woman when her destiny is violently taken? But at the same time, a strange new possibility begins to appear. The next morning, Sophia came down to breakfast in silence. She wore a simple dress, her hair loose. The maids looked at her with both respect and uncertainty. She was no longer just the daughter of the Bennett couple, the oldest workers on the plantation, but she wasn't exactly the lady of the house either. Ethan was already at the table, drinking tea with clasped hands, eyes on the newspaper, though he seemed to be reading nothing. When she entered, he only nodded. He asked for nothing. He didn't touch her. He said nothing about the previous night. He simply asked, "Do you like warm cornbread with butter?" She nodded, and he ordered more to be brought. Simple gesture. But that morning Sophia felt something shift. Slowly. Like a flame being lit in a cold chamber. The following days were full of small gestures. Ethan spent most of his time working, overseeing the fields and the business. But whenever he returned, he'd find Sophia with a book in her hands, sitting on the porch or sewing something she never seemed to finish. He didn't force conversations, but he'd leave a glass of lemonade by her side, ask if she was comfortable, or simply sit next to her in silence. And it was a different silence, one that didn't demand. Sophia, little by little, began to breathe easier. The weight on her chest was lifting. She wondered if he was behaving this way out of pity, guilt, or because of something he himself couldn't understand yet. Then came the rain. A fierce storm, the kind that makes the world stop. The fields were soaked, thunder tore through the sky, and the house went dark for hours. Sophia, afraid of the lightning, tried to stay strong, but the light disappeared completely, and the wind seemed determined to rip out windows. She ran to the main hall and found Ethan sitting by the unlit fireplace. He looked at her, noticed her fear, and simply extended his arm. She approached slowly, sat beside him. He wrapped her shoulders with a blanket and pulled her close, like someone protecting something rare, something that must not be touched with force. And there, in that lightless night, she allowed herself to rest her head on his chest, not as a wife, but as someone who was slowly beginning to stop being afraid. The following days followed a strange, almost mechanical rhythm, where silence served as a bridge between two worlds that didn't know how to touch. Sophia woke early as always, dressed discreetly, and had breakfast without saying much. Ethan was already at the table. Buried in newspapers he pretended to read. The distance between them was visible, almost solid, like a wall made of everything that hadn't been said on that first night. Though she was officially married to the most powerful man in the region, Sophia felt like an intruder. Not quite a wife, but no longer a servant either. The maids looked at her with a mix of reverence and uncertainty, unsure whether to obey her or treat her as an equal. The house, vast and elegant, seemed to echo her every step, as if judging her presence there. But Ethan made no demands. He didn't touch her. He didn't press. He simply watched. He left early each day for the fields, to meet with foremen, to handle the harvest numbers and business deals. He was a man of decisions, firm and sometimes harsh with his workers. But at home with Sophia he seemed different. Not sweet, but restrained, as if constantly holding himself back from a cliff he didn't even know how to name. Sometimes, he'd leave a book on the table that she had once mentioned. Other times, he'd have the cook prepare a dish she'd said she liked. And some evenings, he'd just sit on the porch beside her, not saying a word, letting the wind speak for them. These small gestures did not go unnoticed. Sophia didn't understand, but she felt it. Something was growing. Not passion, not yet. But something rarer, respect. One afternoon, Sophia decided to enter the library, a room she had never dared explore before. It was a dark hall with tall shelves full of old volumes, maps, and a noble wooden desk. There was dust, yes, but there was also soul in that room. She found notebooks filled with handwritten notes, Ethan's. Pages of investment records, but also fragments of thoughts, pieces of sentences that seemed to come from someone burdened with much more than numbers. Power weighs heavier in the hands of those who know how to use it. Silence is more honest than promises. What you lose at 16 is never found again. It unsettled her. For the first time, she felt the man before her was more complex than the title Cotton King let on. There was pain. There was memory. There was loneliness. And loneliness was a language Sophia understood. On a rainy night, no lights in the windows, thunder shaking the house, Sophia awoke startled and went down to the main hall. Ethan was there, leaning near the unlit fireplace, staring into the invisible flames that never lit. She said nothing. She walked to him in silence. He looked at her as if seeing a kind ghost. And then, for the first time, he extended his arm. She accepted. Sat beside him, wrapped in a shawl, resting her head on his shoulder. They said nothing. But in that quiet, there was an agreement. An unspoken pact between two broken hearts learning to breathe together. And for the first time, Sophia didn't fear the house, or him, or herself. In the days that followed, she began to explore more of the estate. She walked the fields, observed the crops, spoke with the workers. Some were skeptical, others respectful. She brought a new presence, not of a tyrant mistress, but of a woman who listened. She learned the names of the workers' children, requested simple reports, helped distribute clothes she had commissioned. Ethan watched everything from afar. He didn't interfere, but he noticed. And one night, as they dined in silence, he said, "You have a gift to see what I don't." She raised her eyes, surprised. Didn't know what to say. She just smiled faintly. And he, for a moment, returned the smile with his eyes, not his mouth. Because Ethan Parker still didn't know how to smile. But Sophia knew he was learning. That same week, a letter arrived from the city. It was from Avery. She and Peter had been arrested in another village, accused of fraud. They were selling fake jewelry, pretending to be nobles, deceiving families. The news spread quickly and hit the Collins family like a bomb, who tried to hide the scandal. Ethan said nothing to his wife, but Sophia found out through the maids. And when she walked into the library, she found the letter on the table. She picked it up, read it, and left it where it was. When Ethan arrived, she simply said, "I'm sorry for her." He looked at her serious and replied, "I'm not." After a moment he added, "But I regret almost marrying a woman who didn't have the courage to be honest." Sophia nodded. And in that exchanged glance, something was sealed. A mutual acceptance. A symbolic end to something that never should have begun. And perhaps, the beginning of something that didn't need promises to exist. Over time, their relationship stopped being merely polite coexistence. It became a silent dance of closeness. He began to notice the flowers she liked, the color she chose for her dresses, the time she enjoyed being alone. And she, in turn, began to understand his silences, the signs of fatigue, the subtle gestures with which he asked for company. There were no declarations, no stolen kisses, but there were hands that touched by accident and didn't pull away. There were lingering glances at sunset, shared drinks, quiet laughter over trivial mistakes. The house, once so cold and full of shadows, now smelled of warm bread, fresh flowers and hope. And though no one spoke it aloud, the truth was clear. Something was growing between Ethan and Sophia. Something that not even time could stop. By the end of that spring, the cotton fields began to bloom white, as if the sky had touched the earth, and the Parker estate took on an almost magical air. The scent of the flowers mingled with a warm southern breeze and wrapped the big house in a breath of new life. Sophia walked through the fields as if she owned them, even though she had never claimed that place for herself. And Ethan, from a distance, watched everything with eyes that once held harshness, but now reflected a kind of quiet peace. He was no longer the man who commanded presence solely through the weight of his past, but someone who had rediscovered the value of a gentle touch, of a simple word, of the quiet company of a woman who had never dreamed of being his, and who now was indispensable. One morning, coming down for breakfast, Sophia found the table set with a small note beside a wildflower, one of those she would pick during walks at the back of the property. On the paper, a single sentence. "Would you walk with me today?" As if we were just two strangers discovering the world. She read the note more than once, her heart beating in the rhythm of the youth she had tried to bury when she chose to become a nun. And without thinking too much, she went back upstairs to change. She chose a light dress, pale blue in color, and let her hair down for the first time since she had entered that house as a wife. When she came down, She found Ethan waiting with 2 saddled horses and a restrained but genuine smile. The ride was calm, full of silent pauses and exchanged glances of complicity, and even though their hands never touched, both knew there was something between them that could no longer be ignored, not even by caution. That same evening, as Sophia read a book on the porch and Ethan adjusted the lantern beside her, the silence between them was broken by an unexpected confession. He spoke of his youth, of the sudden loss of his parents, of the fear he felt when he had to manage everything alone at 16, of the loneliness he hid behind numbers, work, and harsh decisions. "Everything I did was to protect what was left of me," he said, looking into the darkness ahead, as if speaking to himself. Sophia didn't respond immediately. She simply closed the book and placed her hand over his, across the table. Not to console but to be with him. Because sometimes what a man needs is not an answer, but a presence that helps him remember he's not alone. And it was there, under the starry sky of Silver Hollow, that the invisible wall between the two truly began to crumble, brick by brick. Gradually, Ethan began to transform small gestures into silent declarations. A chair pulled closer for her. A carefully served plate. A whispered compliment when she laughed absent-mindedly. Sophia in turn saw herself differently too. No longer hiding the shine in her eyes behind veils of shyness, she started smiling with a lightness she had forgotten she possessed. One day, while organizing books in the library, she found an unfinished letter written by Ethan, as if he had wanted to say everything but didn't know where to start. "If time allows, I want to learn how to love without haste, without fear, without armor," one line read. She read it with teary eyes, knowing that line was in some way a promise. Not from a man who easily spoke his feelings, but from someone who built love carefully, like one who plants and waits for the right season to bloom. And then, on a particularly hot afternoon, while the workers rested and the town's bells rang in the distance, Ethan approached Sophia on the porch, where she sewed absent-mindedly. He slowly knelt before her, held her hands firmly, and said, eyes locked on hers, "I didn't choose you. Fate did. But if I could go back in time today, I would have asked for you from the very first day." It wasn't a proposal, nor a declaration full of embellishments. But Sophia knew it was love. The kind of love that is born in silence, grows through gestures, and blooms in the soul. She didn't reply with words. She simply leaned forward and kissed his forehead, just as he had done to her on their wedding night. One cycle closed. Another deeper one began. And before we move on to the next chapter, a gentle pause. If this story has touched your heart in any way, if you felt something different reading these words, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments, what kind of romance do you dream of seeing here? Your wish might become the next story we tell. Time kept moving, and with it, the Parker estate changed color, rhythm, and scent. Harvest time approached, and the once white fields now bustled with the sound of cartwheels, tools, and the hurried chatter of workers. But even amid the typical commotion of that season, there was a corner of the big house where time seemed to stop. The back garden, where Sophia and Ethan, increasingly close, created a world of their own, apart from duties, appearances, and the past. Sometimes they'd sit there for hours without saying a word, just side by side, listening to the birds and watching the soft ballet of leaves in the wind. And it was in that shared silence that their love deepened, more than any rushed vow or stolen kiss ever could. Sophia, who once barely dared to lift her eyes, now laughed freely, and Ethan, always so restrained, showed himself more and more willing to shed the armor he had worn for so many years. But not everyone saw that love with kind eyes. In town, rumors ran rampant. The maid became the lady, some said, in tones ranging from shock to scorn. Others murmured on street corners that the Parker family had lost its mind, that Ethan had been bewitched by a girl with no noble blood, no title, no fortune. Philip Collins himself, father of the runaway ex-fiancée, didn't hide his disdain whenever Ethan and Sophia's names came up in public. And though Sophia knew that their union hadn't been built according to the standards accepted by the local elite, she remained unfazed. Day by day, she was learning to stand firm in her own name, her own presence, and above all, in her right to love and be loved. There was a quiet flame growing inside her, a strength not made of shouting or confrontation, but of persistence, of the courage to remain in a place where many believed she never belonged. It was on a rainy night that everything changed once again. Ethan was returning from the city, his face tense and burdened. In the library, he asked to speak with Sophia alone. With his eyes fixed on the fire in the hearth, he revealed he had received an anonymous letter, a veiled threat. "They say your presence by my side tarnishes my name, my reputation, and that if I insist on this, I'll lose the most important trade deals in the South." Sophia remained silent for a moment, digesting those words like someone swallowing stones. "And what are you going to do?" she asked, her voice firm and unwavering. Ethan looked at her like a man watching a field about to catch fire, but he responded without hesitation. "I'm going to go on, because I'm not afraid of losing business. But I'm terrified of losing you." Those words, spoken with such intensity, burned hotter than the fire itself. Sophia then stood, approached him, and for the first time kissed him on the lips, with the certainty of someone who knows that love, when true, is also an act of resistance. In the following days, the tension only increased. Invitations to balls were declined, contracts were suspended, and some merchants began charging higher prices for goods destined for the Parker estate. But Ethan stood firm, and Sophia became even more present. She began tending to the workers with care, organizing supplies, distributing meals, and even sewing clothes for the children of families living near the property. And thus respect for her slowly began to grow, not among the nobles but among the humble. To those who truly knew her, Sophia was much more than a maid elevated to wife. She was a woman who loved with her soul and returned all that life gave her with kindness. And Ethan, silently, became a better man by her side. He no longer made decisions alone, no longer hid behind pride, and even the workers noticed that the old Cotton King smiled more and spoke more gently. One gesture from Ethan marked this time of trials. Without Sophia knowing, he had the old chapel on the farm restored. It had been closed since his parents' death. When she saw the place reopened with clean stained glass windows, candles lit, and the pews polished again, she couldn't hold back her tears. "I thought maybe you'd want a space just for you to speak with God," he said, handing her a small golden key. Sophia embraced the gift as if embracing her very childhood, and there, in that sacred space, she found strength to keep going. She began visiting the chapel every dawn, praying not just for herself, but for Ethan, for the farm, for those around them. And seeing her there on her knees, her face bathed in the soft morning light, Ethan understood that there was something in her that could never be explained with words. A silent, unshakable faith that made him want to be worthy of her every single day. And so, even amidst threats, the scorn of some, and commercial losses, the Parker estate flourished in a new way. Cotton was still harvested, cattle still fed. But what truly sustained that empire now was the love growing between Sophia and Ethan. Not the theatrical love of salon novels, nor the urgent desire of forbidden encounters, but a love built in the everyday. In sacrifices, in the courage to keep going even when everything said it wasn't possible. It was the kind of love that's never asked for. It simply happens. And for that very reason it was the truest of all. That summer morning, the sky was unusually clear, as if time itself were holding its breath. Sophia awoke earlier than usual, with a restlessness in her chest she couldn't name. It was as if the very wind whispered an omen. Without fully understanding why, she dressed more carefully than usual and went to the chapel. There she prayed for silence and peace, but also for strength. Something inside her said she would need it. Meanwhile, Ethan was reviewing documents in his office when a carriage stopped in front of the main house. It was an unannounced visit. The door burst open and, cloaked in arrogance, Philip Collins stepped out, and he wasn't alone. Beside him, almost unrecognizable in fine clothes and with a mocking smile, stood Peter Callahan. Peter's presence, now dressed as a true Southern gentleman, struck the air like a dry blow. He was no longer the traveling salesman he once had been. He carried a leather briefcase, a victorious gaze, and a gold ring on the ring finger of his left hand, a clear symbol. He had married Avery. Seeing him, Ethan felt something shift inside. Not anger, but something deeper. The realization that this man had run off with his fiancée and now returned as if nothing had happened. Philip, with his sharp voice, got straight to the point. "I came to propose a deal. Peter will take over the negotiations of the new plantation in Greenville. But for that, we need logistical support and credit from Parker Farm." Ethan narrowed his eyes, incredulous. "You come into my home after your daughter ran from the altar with him, and ask me to finance her lover?" The silence was heavy, but Peter was the one who replied, in a voice too calm for the moment. "What's past is past. Business must move on. And we both know, feelings change." Sophia, watching from a distance, couldn't help the chill that ran down her spine. That phrase, "feelings change," fell like poison in her ears. She, who had taken so long to trust, who had fought through every fear to open her heart, now stood face to face with the shadow of a past threatening everything she had built. Ethan saw her standing in the hallway, and their eyes met. That's when he did something unexpected. He stepped forward, faced the two men before him and said, "This farm is built on a truth you've never known, loyalty. And that can't be bought at any price." Philip laughed, sarcastic. "Loyalty? With a maid you forced to marry you?" But Ethan was no longer the same man as before. And he replied firmly, "Force is what was done to Avery. Sophia chose me. And I choose her. Every single day." The tension in the room was thick as the air before a storm. Peter, unsettled, tried to assert himself with an even more generous offer. He promised double the profits in a year, access to new markets, and even the social forgiveness that, according to him, Ethan needed to regain his prestige. But at that moment, not even the most seductive figures had any value. Ethan looked at Sophia and said aloud, for everyone to hear, "I wouldn't trade a single day with her for all the deals in the South." Philip, humiliated, stormed out. Peter, before leaving, gave Sophia one last look, as if realizing too late that he had underestimated the strength of that woman. And it was in that instant that Sophia felt something inside her break, a final tie coming undone. She was no longer a girl afraid to live. She was a woman who knew what she deserved. But the southern winds never stay quiet for long. The next day, the farm awoke to rumors of sabotage. Part of the barn had been set on fire during the night. No one was hurt, but the damage was extensive. It was evident. The attack had been premeditated. Local authorities began investigating, but everything pointed to commercial, perhaps even political, retaliation. Sophia, without losing her composure, led the workers in damage control. She reorganized the supplies, tended to the animals, and reassured the families living there. And once again, she proved that her place there was no accident. It was earned. Ethan, watching that woman in action, knew with certainty that he had made no mistake in choosing her. But at the same time, he also knew that such love would come at a high cost, and that their days of peace might soon be over. In the nights that followed, Sophia began to dream of the past. She dreamt of her father, his eyes full of pride. She dreamt of the convent she almost chose, of white veils, of psalms whispered in dim corridors. But in the final dreams, it was always Ethan at the end of the hallway, reaching out and saying, "You are my peace." When she woke, her heart was both warm and afraid. There was peace there, yes, but also a new fear, as if destiny itself were testing the limits of what she could bear. And, in truth, something was about to happen. Concerned about the farm's safety, Ethan decided to host a formal dinner to gather his still loyal allies. He invited judges, merchants, former partners, and even representatives from neighboring estates. It would be a night to reaffirm power, and also to publicly defend his union with Sophia. She hesitated at first, but understood that it was time to fully assume her position, not as a forced wife, but as a woman beside the man she had chosen. In preparation, she wore a gown embroidered by her mother years before, and styled her hair with the help of Clara, the housekeeper who had always treated her like a daughter. She was beautiful, yes, but her beauty was more than appearance. It was the beauty of someone who had survived doubt, fear, and contempt. The beauty of someone who carries, in every gesture, the seed of transformation. The night of the dinner arrived like a silent storm. Candles were lit. The table was set with antique silverware, and the finest wines were uncorked. But in Sophia's heart, there was more anticipation than fear. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that judgmental stares and poisonous words would come, but she also knew that within those walls, there was real love, and that was what she would count on. When Ethan saw her enter the hall, he paused for a moment. In his eyes was admiration, but also a silent plea for forgiveness, for everything she had to endure to get there. And she, smiling back at him, said without words, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The dinner was about to begin. But what would happen that night would change everything. Forever. When the guests sat around the long, polished oak table, something in the air seemed suspended, as if time had tucked itself into a corner of the room to watch in silence. The conversation started off quietly, politely, but every eye somehow turned to Sophia. It was as if that young woman, once invisible in the halls of the estate, now shone with a light no one could ignore. But there were also glances laced with judgment, hushed whispers, smiles with clenched teeth. She knew. She wasn't welcome by everyone. To some, she would always be the maid who became a lady. But Sophia kept her chin high, her heart steady, and Ethan's hand discreetly resting on her leg like a silent reminder. You belong. During dinner, between raised glasses and hollow toasts, Ethan gave a speech that many would never forget. He didn't talk about crops or profits or prestige. He spoke of love. He told how Sophia had entered his life without intending to stay, how she carried in her eyes a faith he'd never known, how her silent and gentle presence had become his anchor in days when everything seemed to fall apart. He said in front of everyone that he had never been loved that way before. And more, that he had never learned how to truly love until he met her. A thick silence followed, then a timid applause that slowly rippled across the room like a restrained wave. Sophia didn't cry, but her misty eyes said everything. That was the redemption of a story marked by the improbable. That was the night truth found its voice. But fate, master of dramatizing sacred moments, wouldn't let that night end in peace so easily. At the height of the celebration, just as the musicians were about to begin the first waltz, a scream cut through the air. It was Clara, the housekeeper. She came running from the stables, pale and breathless. It's fire, fire in the new barn. The entire room stood up in shock. Ethan, without hesitation, ran outside. Sophia, though held back, followed closely behind. Flames already danced on the horizon like orange serpents, devouring everything. It was clear. This was no accident. It was revenge. Someone wanted to destroy not just the farm, but what it represented. Men ran with buckets, horses neighed in panic, and chaos erupted. But in the midst of that confusion, Sophia saw a figure fleeing through the back fields. Someone hooded, but with steps she recognized instantly. It was Peter. She said nothing, just stood frozen in shock. She understood everything. He couldn't accept that he had lost. Couldn't accept that the woman he had once scorned was now truly loved. But in that moment, there was no room for fear or anger. Sophia ran back into the house and grabbed the documents Ethan kept in secret. Land records, contracts, licenses. She knew the fire wasn't just symbolic. They wanted to destroy everything, even the proof of ownership. When she returned to the fields, Ethan saw her, covered in soot, shielding the papers with her own body. It was there, in the middle of smoke and chaos, that he embraced her like a man who had found home after a war. You are my salvation, Sophia, he whispered, his voice choked. And she, eyes glistening, replied, and you are my freedom. The fire was finally contained, but not without struggle. They lost part of the crop, but saved the essential. The farm would survive. The next day, the entire town knew what had happened. But for the first time, the talk wasn't about scandal. It was about respect. The woman everyone had judged fragile had faced chaos with the strength of someone who owes nothing to anyone. Sophia had now become a symbol of courage. And Ethan, once known as the Cotton King, became known as the man who dared to love beyond convention. On the veranda of the main house at sunset, he gave her a small silver locket engraved with the words, "Chosen, not imposed." It was the symbol of a new chapter, of a love not born of desire, but of decision. The years went by. The farm prospered like never before. Children ran through the fields, the cotton bloomed whiter and softer than ever, and the afternoons were filled with stories, laughter, and soft melodies coming from the parlor piano. Sophia never forgot what they had lived. She kept everything in a handwritten journal, page by page, night after night, so that one day their children would know. True love doesn't arrive with fireworks, but with silent gestures and resolute choices. Ethan, for his part, never ceased to thank God for Avery's no. A no that, unknowingly, opened the path to the most important yes of his life. In the end, everything made sense. In the end, it was the unlikely that revealed the extraordinary. And maybe that's the lesson of it all. That true love doesn't always come as we planned. Sometimes it's pushed by the hands of fate, torn from where we least expect it, and placed before us as a new chance. Sophia and Ethan didn't choose each other at the beginning, but in the end they chose each other every single day. And that's what matters. That we're remembered not for the promises we made, but for the choices we kept making with our whole hearts, even when everything seemed against us. This isn't just a love story. It's the story of two souls who met in pain and blossomed in courage. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel. Here, every story carries hidden truths, emotions you may have lived, and others you still will. Leave a like, tell us in the comments what you felt. And come back often, because love, dear viewer, lives in the details. And in the reunions only time can explain.